What if everything you've heard about this war is only the surface? What if the missiles, the explosions, the emergency meetings, and the breaking news alerts were never the real story? Because on one single night, the United States launched what officials described as some of the heaviest strikes against targets inside Iran in recent years. But here's the question almost nobody is asking. Why did America react with such overwhelming force? Was it simply retaliation? Or had Washington been waiting for this exact moment all along? And if that's true, then the real battle may have started long before the first missile ever left its launcher. Tonight, we're going to reconstruct that night, minute by minute, decision by decision, from intelligence warnings to military planning to the strikes themselves, and finally, to the revelation that could completely change how you understand this conflict. But be warned, some of the biggest answers won't come until the very end, because hidden inside this story are several mysteries. What really happened before the attempted attack on American troops? Why were certain military sites hit while others were left untouched? Which decision inside Washington changed the entire operation? Was this a response to one attack or part of a much larger strategy? And what happened after the explosions that could shape the Middle East for years to come? To answer those questions, we have to go back, not to the night of the strikes, but to the weeks before anyone heard the sound of an explosion. Because history rarely begins with missiles. It begins with warnings, warnings that most people never notice until it's already too late. Chapter 1. The calm before the fire wars almost never begin on the day they appear on television. Long before headlines announce airstrikes, long before fighter jets take off, and long before governments issue statements, there are quiet movements that only a handful of people notice. A radar station suddenly becomes more active. A surveillance drone changes its flight path. Fuel tankers begin arriving at military airfields. Cargo aircraft land in the middle of the night. Intelligence officers start working longer hours. Diplomats cancel vacations. Military commanders hold meetings behind closed doors. To the outside world, nothing seems unusual, but inside command centers, everyone understands the same thing. Something is coming. In the weeks leading up to the latest confrontation, tensions between the United States and Iran had been climbing once again. Every military movement, every political speech, every regional incident was being analyzed. Not because leaders wanted war, but because neither side wanted to be caught unprepared if war arrived first. American forces across the Middle East increased their alert levels. Air defense systems remained on standby. Reconnaissance aircraft spent more time in the sky. Naval assets monitored critical waterways. Meanwhile, Iran and its regional network continued signaling that any future strike against them would not go unanswered. Each side watched the other. Each side tried to predict the other's next move. It was a dangerous game, because history has shown that wars don't always begin because someone wants them. Sometimes, they begin because someone believes the other side is about to act first. That fear has started some of history's largest conflicts. And once that cycle begins, every defensive move can look offensive. Every warning can be mistaken for preparation. Every deployment can become a reason for escalation. By this point, analysts across the world were asking the same question. If another confrontation happened, where would it begin? Would it happen in the Persian Gulf? Would it happen through proxy groups? Would it happen in the skies over the region? Or somewhere nobody expected? The answer will arrive faster than almost anyone imagined. Because on one ordinary day, inside an operations room, an intelligence report appeared. At first, it looked like just another routine update. But within minutes, phones started ringing. Military officers stood up from their chairs. Screens across command centers changed. And suddenly, the quiet tension that had been building for weeks turned into something far more dangerous. No one outside those rooms knew it yet, but the countdown had already begun. And before long, the first missile would be on its way. The warning that changed everything. There is a saying inside military intelligence. The most dangerous attack is often the one you only understand after it has already begun. By the time the public hears the first breaking news alert, someone somewhere has already been making life or death decisions for hours. And on this night, Those decisions would determine whether the Middle East was heading toward another limited confrontation or a much larger war. But before a single missile was intercepted, before fighter aircraft roared into the sky, there was a warning. A warning that, according to U.S. officials, could not be ignored. The intelligence report inside military headquarters, information never arrives as one complete picture. It comes in fragments, a radar track, a satellite image, an intercepted communication, a sudden movement of military equipment. By themselves, they may not mean much. Together, they can reveal an operation already in motion. According to U.S. officials, intelligence suggested preparations for an attack targeting American forces stationed in Jordan. No one knew the exact timing. No one could say with certainty how large the attack might be. But commanders knew one thing. If the warning was accurate, they had only a very small window to prepare. Across the region, defensive systems were placed on heightened alert. Personnel reviewed emergency procedures. Air defense crews took their positions. Command centers began operating at full capacity. Outside, life continued almost normally. Inside military installations, everyone was waiting. The first launch. Then, it happened. Radar operators detected fast-moving objects. Within seconds, multiple tracking systems confirmed the same conclusion. Missiles were in the air. For the soldiers on the ground, there was almost no time to think. Only time to react. Air defense batteries engaged. Interceptors were launched. Warning sirens echoed across military positions. Every second mattered. The difference between success and failure could be measured in moments. According to U.S. officials, the incoming attack was intercepted before it caused major damage to American forces. But interception did not end the crisis. It only marked the beginning. Because now, Washington faced an even more difficult question. How should the United States respond? Inside Washington, thousands of miles away, lights stayed on inside secure government buildings. Military commanders delivered updates. Intelligence agencies compared incoming reports. Civilian leaders demanded answers. Was this an isolated incident? Or the opening move in something larger? Respond too weakly, and future attacks might become more likely. Respond too strongly, and the region could slide into a wider conflict. This was no longer just a military calculation. It was a political, strategic, and diplomatic decision all at once, and every option carried risks. The clock starts ticking. Military planners are trained for moments exactly like this. Long before a crisis begins, they prepare possible response options. Different targets, different aircraft, different levels of force, different political consequences. Those plans often remain locked away, never used, until suddenly they aren't. Now those plans were pulled from secure systems. Maps appeared across briefing screens. Target folders were reviewed. Aircraft availability was confirmed. Weather conditions were checked. Refueling routes were examined. Communications networks were tested. Everything suggested that if an order came, the response could begin quickly. But one mystery remained. If retaliation was approved, where would it begin? Would the United States strike only the launch sites? Would it target command centers? Would it send a political message or attempt to reduce Iran's future military capabilities? That answer was known only to a very small group of people, and they had very little time to decide. The decision history often remembers the explosions. It rarely remembers the silence beforehand. The few minutes when leaders weigh consequences that could reshape entire regions. Those minutes are invisible to the public. No cameras, no speeches, only decisions. Then the order was given. The operation would move forward. Pilots received encrypted instructions. Support aircraft prepared for launch. Mission commanders opened sealed operational packages. Across multiple bases, engines began to start. The retaliation was no longer a possibility. It had become a mission. But one question still remained unanswered. Why had several unexpected locations been added to the target list? Those sites would become one of the biggest mysteries of the entire operation. And understanding them would require looking far beyond the battlefield itself, because the strikes were about more than destroying military infrastructure. They were sending a message that would be understood differently in Washington, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and Jerusalem. And once those aircraft crossed the point of no return, there would be no turning back. The mission that was already planned. People often imagine military operations beginning with a phone call. A president gives an order, generals salute, pilots run toward waiting aircraft, and within minutes, war begins. Reality is very different. The most complex military operations are usually planned long before anyone knows they'll ever be needed, which raises a disturbing question. If America's response happened so quickly, how much of this mission had already existed on paper? And had both sides been preparing for this confrontation for much longer than anyone realized? The war plans that never sleep. Inside every modern military, there are contingency plans, hundreds of them. Some are never used, some remain classified for decades, and some are updated almost every day. Not because war is inevitable, but because if it comes, there won't be time to start planning from scratch. Every possible scenario is studied. Every major military installation is analyzed. Every radar system, every missile battery, every command center, every air defense network can become part of a future operational map. When a crisis erupts, planners don't create a new operation overnight. They adapt an existing one. And that's exactly why the response appeared so fast. Building the strike package, modern air campaigns are like orchestras. No single aircraft wins the battle alone. Each one has a role. Some gather intelligence, some protect the formation, some suppress enemy air defenses. Others deliver precision weapons. Electronic warfare aircraft attempt to confuse enemy radar. Airborne command platforms coordinate everything from above. Tanker aircraft quietly keep fighters in the air hundreds of miles from home. To the public, it may look like a handful of jets flying toward a target. In reality, it's a carefully synchronized network involving dozens of aircraft. Satellites, surveillance systems, ground controllers, and intelligence analysts. One mistake can jeopardize the entire mission. Choosing the targets. This is where military strategy becomes psychology, because not every target is chosen simply because it's valuable. Sometimes, a target is selected because of what its destruction communicates. Destroy a missile launcher, and you remove an immediate threat. Destroy a command center, and you disrupt coordination. Destroy logistics facilities, and future operations become harder. But there is another category of target. One designed not only to reduce military capability, but to send a strategic message. Military planners understand that wars are fought with symbols as much as with weapons. A carefully selected target can influence political leaders, military commanders, allies, and even public opinion. That is why analysts immediately noticed something unusual after the strikes. Some locations appeared obvious. Others did not. One particular site puzzled experts. At first glance, it seemed less important than several nearby military facilities. Pilots call it the point of no return. Fuel calculations change. Routes are locked in. Communications become minimal. Everyone knows what comes next. Somewhere in the darkness, air crews check their instruments one last time. Coordinates confirmed. Weapons armed. Formation maintained. No dramatic speeches, no celebrations. Just professionals carrying out one of the most demanding missions imaginable. Meanwhile, inside command centers, large digital maps displayed every aircraft in real time. Analysts watched radar coverage. Weather updates continued to arrive. Satellite feeds refreshed constantly. Every movement was tracked. Because even the best plans can change in seconds. The first explosion. Then, without warning, the waiting ended. The first precision-guided weapon reached its target. Seconds later, another impact. Then another. Across multiple locations, Carefully planned strikes unfolded almost simultaneously. Military planners prefer overwhelming speed. The goal is simple: reduce the opponent's ability to react before they fully understand what's happening. Explosions illuminated military facilities. Air defense crews attempted to respond. Communications networks became overloaded. Reports began flowing in from every direction. Inside Washington, commanders monitored the operation in near real time. Inside Tehran, leaders were trying to determine the scale of what had just begun. But neither side yet knew the full picture, because something unexpected happened during those opening moments. One target, the mysterious target, produced a reaction far greater than military analysts had anticipated. Why? What made that location so important? And why would governments avoid discussing it publicly? Those questions wouldn't be answered tonight. Not yet, because before we can understand the significance of that strike, we first need to see how Iran responded in the critical hours that followed. The next decisions made in Tehran would determine whether this remained a limited exchange or became the opening chapter of something much larger. Inside Tehran, the hours that could decide a war. Why global powers suddenly became deeply interested in this conflict, and why one narrow stretch of water, thousands of ships cross it every year, could suddenly become the center of the world's attention. Only then will the first pieces of the documentary's biggest mystery begin to fall into place, when the battlefield became global. The explosions inside Iran lasted only minutes, but their consequences began traveling around the world almost instantly, because in the 21st century, a modern conflict doesn't stay where the missiles land. It spreads through oil markets, shipping lanes, financial exchanges, diplomatic back channels, and military headquarters thousands of miles away. The battlefield had expanded, not because new bombs were falling, but because every major power was now asking the same question. What happens next? And the answer could affect far more than just the United States and Iran. The first calls within hours of the strikes. Secure communication lines between world capitals became unusually active. National security advisors requested emergency briefings. Defense ministries demanded updated intelligence. Embassies sought clarification from allies. No government wanted to wake up to a regional crisis that had suddenly become an international one. Because history has shown, the first 24 hours after a major military operation often determine whether a conflict remains limited or begins expanding beyond anyone's original intentions. The strait that connects the world. If you look at a map, you'll notice something extraordinary. A narrow stretch of water, small enough to seem insignificant at first glance, yet every day, a tremendous amount of the world's energy passes through it. Tankers, cargo ships, naval patrols, commercial traffic. Everything moving through that corridor depends on one thing: stability. Military planners understand this better than anyone. You don't need to block an entire shipping route forever. Sometimes, the mere possibility of disruption is enough to change global calculations. Insurance costs rise. Shipping companies alter routes. Energy traders react. Markets begin pricing in uncertainty. And suddenly, a conflict that appears regional starts affecting countries thousands of miles away. Watching from afar. As events unfolded, other major powers were watching closely. Not because they were directly involved in the strikes, but because every military confrontation reveals valuable lessons. How quickly did the operation unfold? How effective were the defenses? How precise were the strikes? How did each side communicate? Military analysts studied these questions carefully, not only to understand today's conflict, but to prepare for tomorrow's. Every major operation becomes a case study. Every decision becomes data. Every success and every mistake is examined in remarkable detail. The invisible front. Most viewers imagine war as explosions and fighter jets, but another battle begins almost immediately. The battle for information. Official statements are released. Military spokespeople provide updates. Analysts debate the available evidence. Social media fills with claims. Counterclaims, videos, old footage presented as new, and rumors spreading faster than facts. For ordinary people, it becomes increasingly difficult to separate verified information from speculation. That is why responsible analysis matters, because understanding a conflict requires patience, not just speed. Sometimes, the most honest answer is simply, we don't know yet. And in moments like these, that uncertainty can be more revealing than certainty itself. A pattern begins to emerge. As intelligence agencies and independent analysts reviewed the operation, they noticed something interesting. The strikes appeared carefully limited, powerful enough to send a message, but measured enough to avoid automatically triggering an all-out regional war. That balance, if intentional, revealed something important. The objective may not have been unlimited escalation. It may have been controlled deterrence, a demonstration of capability combined with an attempt to avoid crossing certain strategic red lines. But deterrence only works if both sides interpret the message the same way. And history tells us that assumption can be dangerously optimistic, the missing piece. By now, we've answered several important questions: how tensions built, how the attempted attack changed the situation, how the United States organized its response, how Tehran entered the critical hours after the strikes, and why the rest of the world suddenly paid attention. But one mystery remains untouched. Why were certain facilities considered so strategically significant? At first, they appeared to be ordinary military targets. The more experts studied them, the more unusual they became. Their importance wasn't defined only by what they contained, but by what they represented. And that story takes us far beyond a single night's military operation. To understand it, we have to travel back through decades of rivalry, strategic doctrine, and decisions made long before these latest strikes. Because sometimes, the most important target in a conflict isn't the one causing the biggest explosion. It's the one sending the clearest message. And that message has been building for years. The next chapter begins not with another missile, but with history itself. Because without understanding the past, it's impossible to understand why this night unfolded the way it did, the conflict that didn't begin this year. If you only look at the explosions, you'll never understand the war. Because wars are rarely born in a single night. They are built year after year, decision after decision, until eventually, one spark ignites everything that has been quietly accumulating beneath the surface. The strikes we've been following were not created in a vacuum. To understand why they happened, we have to go back. Not a few weeks, not a few months, but decades, because this story isn't simply about missiles. It's about trust that disappeared, strategies that evolved, and two nations that came to see each other as long-term rivals. When rivals stop believing each other. Every prolonged geopolitical rivalry follows a similar pattern. One side strengthens its defenses. The other interprets that as preparation for aggression. In response, it strengthens its own position. The cycle repeats. Each action is described as defensive by the country taking it and offensive by the country watching it. This dynamic is known by many strategists as the security dilemma. Neither side may intend to start a war, yet both become increasingly prepared for one. Eventually, the distance between preparation and confrontation becomes dangerously small. And once that happens, even a limited incident can trigger a much larger crisis. A generation of preparation over the years, the Middle East became one of the most heavily monitored regions on Earth. Satellites passed overhead daily, reconnaissance aircraft flew routine missions. Naval forces maintained a constant presence in key waterways. Military exercises tested new strategies. Air defense systems became more advanced. Precision weapons became more accurate. Electronic warfare grew more sophisticated. Each improvement changed the strategic balance, and each improvement forced everyone else to adapt. This wasn't an arms race driven by one event. It was the result of years of mutual competition. The strategy behind the strikes. Military operations are often misunderstood. People assume success is measured only by the number of targets destroyed. Professional planners think differently. Sometimes, the true objective is to shape future decisions, to influence what an opponent does next, to convince them that certain actions will carry unacceptable costs. This is the logic of deterrence, not eliminating every threat, but changing the calculations behind future choices. Viewed through that lens, the latest strikes become more than a military operation. They become a strategic signal, a message intended to be read not only by Iran, but by allies, adversaries, and observers around the world. The cost of miscalculation. History is filled with wars that no one originally planned. They happened because leaders misunderstood each other's intentions, because signals were interpreted differently, because one side believed the other would back down, or because each side believed it was acting defensively. That's why communication during a crisis matters almost as much as military capability. Every public statement, every diplomatic message, every military movement can reduce tension or increase it, sometimes without anyone intending it. The question everyone was asking. As the world watched the aftermath of the strikes, analysts focused on one issue above all others. Would this remain a limited exchange, or had both sides entered a cycle of action and reaction from which it would become increasingly difficult to step away? No one could answer that question immediately, because the future of any crisis depends not only on military strength, but on political judgment. History offers examples of conflicts that ended after one dramatic exchange. It also offers examples where each retaliation led to another, until the original cause was almost forgotten. At this moment, the world didn't yet know which path this crisis would follow. The open loop begins to close. Remember the mystery we introduced at the very beginning. Why did the United States choose those particular targets? At first, the answer seemed simple: military necessity. But the deeper we looked, the more another possibility emerged. Perhaps the strikes weren't designed only to destroy capabilities. Perhaps they were designed to demonstrate reach, precision, and the ability to hold strategically important assets at risk if future escalation occurred. If that's true, then the operation was communicating something far beyond the battlefield. It was saying we can respond rapidly, accurately, and at a scale of our choosing. Whether that message succeeds depends entirely on how it is interpreted by the other side. And that's where the final chapters of this documentary take us. Because after the smoke cleared, the real contest was no longer about bombs. It was about decisions. Decisions that could either slow the crisis or push it into an entirely new phase. The final pieces of this story are now coming together, but one major question still remains unanswered. What happened behind closed diplomatic doors after the strikes? Because while the world watched military movements, another battle was unfolding in silence. A battle of negotiations, warnings, and strategic calculations. And that invisible struggle may ultimately matter more than the airstrikes themselves. The war behind closed doors. When people think of war, they imagine fighter jets, explosions, and missiles streaking across the night sky. But the most important battle often happens where there are no cameras, no satellite images, no dramatic headlines. Only secure rooms, encrypted phone calls, and leaders trying to answer one terrifying question. How do we stop this from becoming something even bigger? Because after the strikes, every government understood one reality. The next 24 hours could determine whether this crisis would slowly cool or spiral into a regional conflict. Two clocks were ticking from the outside. It looked as though the operation had ended. Inside government headquarters, the pressure was only increasing. Military commanders were asking, "Can we defend against another attack?" Diplomats were asking, "Can we prevent another attack?" Politicians were asking, "What message should we send next?" Three different questions, three different priorities, one shared objective. Avoid a situation where events begin controlling the leaders instead of leaders controlling the events. Because once both sides lose control of escalation, history becomes extremely difficult to reverse. The language of deterrence. Military strategy isn't communicated only through weapons. Sometimes it's communicated through silence. Sometimes through carefully chosen words. A public statement may sound ordinary to most people, but to another government, every sentence can carry hidden meaning. A phrase like, "We reserve the right to respond," can mean many things. It may be a warning. It may be an attempt to discourage further attacks, or it may simply be designed to buy time while leaders decide what comes next. In international crises, language becomes another battlefield. Every word is measured. Every sentence is deliberate, because one careless statement can raise tensions just as quickly as a missile launch. The world watches carefully. As governments assessed the situation, intelligence agencies continued collecting information. Were additional military units moving? Were missile forces changing positions? Were air defense systems becoming more active? These questions mattered, not because movement automatically meant another attack, but because understanding intentions is one of the hardest problems in international security. Capability is visible. Intentions are not. That's why experienced analysts rarely jump to conclusions. They look for patterns, not isolated events, because patterns reveal strategy. Individual incidents often do not. The cost of getting it wrong. Every crisis contains a hidden danger. Not just escalation, miscalculation. Imagine believing your opponent is preparing to strike when they are actually preparing to defend. Imagine interpreting a defensive deployment as an offensive one. History contains numerous examples where misunderstandings intensified already dangerous situations. That doesn't mean conflict is inevitable. It means perception matters. Sometimes, what leaders believe is happening becomes just as important as what is actually happening. The mystery returns now. Let's return to one of the biggest questions from the beginning of this documentary. Why did this particular exchange attract so much international attention? Surely the Middle East has experienced military confrontations before, so why did this one feel different? The answer wasn't simply the scale of the strikes. It wasn't only the attempted attack. It wasn't even the targets themselves. It was the timing. This confrontation occurred during a period when multiple regional and global crises were already competing for the attention of world leaders. That meant every decision carried broader consequences. Not only for Washington, not only for Tehran, but for allies, partners, energy markets, and global stability. This was no longer just about two countries. It had become part of a much larger strategic picture. And that's why governments around the world reacted so quickly. One final question. We've now followed the story from nearly every angle. The warning, the attempted attack, the American response, the strikes, the reaction inside Tehran, the international consequences. But one final mystery remains. If both sides understood the risks, why did events reach this point in the first place? Was this crisis unavoidable? Or were there moments, days, or even hours when different decisions could have changed everything? To answer that, we have to reconstruct the timeline one last time, because hidden within that timeline is the clue that ties every chapter of this documentary together. And once you see it, the entire story begins to look very different. The timeline that changes everything. Let's do something most breaking news coverage never has time to do. Let's stop. Forget the headlines. Forget the political speeches. Forget the social media debates. Instead, let's reconstruct the timeline. One final time. Because sometimes, history isn't changed by the biggest explosion. It's changed by the order in which events happen. And once you put every piece in the correct sequence, a completely different picture begins to emerge. The first piece weeks before the strikes, tensions were already elevated. Military forces remained on heightened alert. Intelligence agencies monitored developments closely. Diplomatic relations were strained. None of these developments meant conflict was inevitable. But they created an environment where even a limited incident could carry much greater consequences. Think of it like dry forest during summer. The forest doesn't create the spark, but once a spark appears, conditions determine how far the fire spreads. The second piece. Then came the attempted attack on American forces, according to U.S. officials, whether viewed as an act of escalation, a response to earlier events, or a part of a broader cycle of retaliation. It fundamentally changed Washington's decision-making. The discussion was no longer theoretical. Decision-makers now had to determine how to respond. That moment became the turning point. Not because war automatically followed, but because every available option carried serious risks. The third piece. The retaliation itself was carefully structured. The targets appeared selected to combine military objectives with strategic signaling. The strikes were intended not only to affect capabilities, but also to communicate resolve. Military operations often carry two audiences: the opponent and everyone else watching. That includes allies, regional partners, and potential adversaries. Every modern military understands this. The fourth piece then came perhaps the most overlooked stage. What happened after the bombs stopped falling? Many people assume that when the explosions end, the crisis is over. In reality, that is often when the most important work begins. Military commanders assess, political leaders evaluate, diplomats communicate, markets react, allies seek reassurance, adversaries reassess. The visible operation may last hours. Its consequences can last months or even years. Connecting the clues. Now let's revisit every major question we've asked. Why did the response happen so quickly? Because modern militaries maintain contingency plans long before they are needed. Why were specific targets selected? Because strategy is about more than destruction. It's also about signaling capability and intent. Why did the entire world pay attention? Because events in the Middle East can have consequences far beyond the battlefield. Why did governments move so carefully afterwards? Because every decision carried the possibility of either reducing tension or increasing it. One by one, the mysteries begin connecting. Not into a conspiracy, but into a strategic pattern. The biggest misunderstanding. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding surrounding conflicts like this is the belief that military power alone determines the outcome. History suggests otherwise. Military strength matters, but so do diplomacy, communication, intelligence, economic resilience, political judgment, and perhaps above all, the ability to prevent today's confrontation from becoming tomorrow's war. The most successful military operation is often the one that achieves its objective without requiring another. Whether this crisis reaches that point depends on decisions that continue long after the headlines fade. One last door remains closed. We've opened nearly every chapter of this story. We've traced the path from rising tensions to the attempted attack, to the strikes, to the global response, and the strategic calculations that followed. Only one door remains unopened. The question we asked in the very first minute: did this night reshape the Middle East, or was it simply another chapter in a rivalry that has continued for decades? The answer isn't found in a single explosion. It's found in what happens afterwards, in the choices made by leaders, in the restraint or escalation that follows, and in the lessons each side believes it learned. In our final two chapters, we'll step back from the battlefield entirely. We'll examine what this confrontation means for the future, who achieved their immediate objectives, who now faces new challenges, and why historians may ultimately judge this night very differently from the way it was first reported. Because sometimes the true impact of history is invisible until years later. Who really won that night? Every war, every airstrike, every military operation creates the same question. Who won? The answer seems obvious at first. Count the explosions, measure the damage, compare the casualties, declare a winner. But history doesn't work that way, because military victories and strategic victories are not always the same thing. Sometimes the side that destroys the most targets still fails to achieve its long-term objective, and sometimes the side that suffers the greatest damage emerges politically stronger. So before we answer the biggest question of this documentary, we need to understand something military historians have known for centuries. The first battle rarely decides the war. Victory is more complicated than it looks. Imagine a chess game. One player sacrifices a powerful piece, the other celebrates. But 5 moves later, everyone realizes that sacrifice was part of a much bigger plan. Geopolitics often works the same way. Military operations are never judged only by what happened that night. They're judged by what changes afterward. Did the strikes prevent future attacks? Did they increase regional stability or deepen hostility? Did they strengthen deterrence or encourage further retaliation? Those questions cannot be answered in the first 24 hours. Sometimes it takes years. The American perspective. From Washington's point of view, the immediate objective was to respond decisively to what U.S. officials described as an attempted attack on American forces. The message was clear. Attacks on U.S. personnel would not go unanswered. Military planners also sought to demonstrate capability, precision, reach, speed, the ability to coordinate complex operations across long distances. But even the most successful military mission leaves policymakers with another challenge. How do you stop the cycle from continuing? Because deterrence succeeds only if it discourages future attacks, without triggering even larger ones. That balance is one of the hardest problems in international strategy. The Iranian perspective. From Tehran's perspective, the challenge looked different. National sovereignty, military credibility, domestic expectations, regional influence. Every government facing military strikes must decide how to respond. Too little response may appear weak. Too much response may risk wider escalation. Finding the balance is extraordinarily difficult, especially when every decision is being watched, not only by domestic audiences, but by allies, rivals, and the international community. The hidden winners. Now let's talk about something rarely discussed. Every major conflict creates unexpected consequences. Defense industries study new technologies. Military academies analyze tactics. Intelligence agencies collect enormous amounts of operational data. Governments revise contingency plans. Future commanders learn lessons from today's battles. Even countries with no direct involvement pay close attention. Because modern conflicts become classrooms for future strategy. This doesn't mean anyone benefits from war. It means every conflict changes how future conflicts are planned. And that influence often lasts much longer than the fighting itself. The open loops finally connect now. Remember every mystery we introduced? Why did the response happen so quickly? Because preparation had been ongoing long before the crisis. Why were specific targets chosen? Because military strategy combines operational objectives with strategic signaling. Why did the world react so strongly? Because the consequences extended far beyond one battlefield. Why did governments immediately begin diplomatic activity? Because preventing escalation became almost as important as responding to it. Every chapter, every clue, every question was pointing toward one conclusion. The real story wasn't only about missiles. It was about decisions. Decisions made before the strikes, during the strikes, and especially after the strikes. History is often shaped less by weapons than by the judgment of the people controlling them. One final mystery remains. We've reached the edge of the final revelation. Only one question remains. The very first question we asked. Did this night change the Middle East forever? Or will historians eventually remember it as one more chapter in a rivalry that has repeatedly moved between confrontation, deterrence, and uneasy restraint? The answer isn't as simple as yes or no, because history isn't written on the night events happen. History is written by what follows, and that is where our story ends, not with certainty, but with perspective, because the final lesson of this documentary isn't about who fired first or who struck hardest. It's about understanding why conflicts begin, how they grow, and how the decisions made in a single night can echo for decades. The night that may be remembered differently. Let's go back to the very first question we asked. What if everything you've heard about this war was only the surface? After nearly 50 minutes, after following the missiles, the command centers, the intelligence warnings, the military planning, the diplomacy, and the consequences, the answer is finally clear. The real story was never just about the explosions. It was about the decisions that produced them. The final reveal. When the first headlines appeared, the world saw missiles. When military analysts examined the operation, they saw strategy. When historians eventually study this moment, they may see something even bigger, a case study of how modern conflicts unfold, not in a single moment, but through a chain of decisions, a warning, a response, a retaliation, a diplomatic calculation, another response. One decision influencing the next, until millions of people across the world suddenly found themselves watching the same crisis. That was the hidden story. Not a secret operation, not an undiscovered conspiracy, but the reality that history is usually shaped by decisions made long before these cameras arrive. The lesson. Throughout this documentary, we kept asking the same question in different ways. Why did this happen? The answer is more complicated than a single sentence. Because international conflicts are rarely caused by one event. They emerge from years of mistrust, competing security concerns, military planning, political pressure, regional dynamics, and moments where leaders must make critical decisions under extraordinary uncertainty. Understanding those factors doesn't require taking one side over another. It requires looking beyond the headlines. Because headlines tell us what happened, history tries to explain why. The human cost. It's easy to become fascinated by aircraft, missiles, satellites, military strategy, maps covered in arrows. But behind every strategic decision, there are human beings, service members carrying out orders, families waiting for loved ones to return, civilians hoping the next explosion doesn't happen near their homes, diplomats working through the night to prevent further escalation. The maps may show territory. History books may record operations. But ordinary people are the ones who ultimately live with the consequences. That reality should never be forgotten. The future, as this documentary comes to an end, one truth remains. No analyst, no government, no journalist can predict the future with certainty. The situation may de-escalate, it may remain tense, or it may evolve in ways nobody currently expects. History remains unwritten, and that's exactly why understanding the present matters, because the choices made tomorrow will determine how this night is remembered years from now. Coming full circle. At the beginning, I asked you a question. Was this simply retaliation or something much bigger? Now you have the answer. It was bigger. Not because it secretly began a new world war, not because of an undisclosed plan hidden from the public, but because it demonstrated how quickly a regional military incident can influence global diplomacy, energy markets, military planning, and international security. Sometimes, history doesn't change because of the size of an explosion. Sometimes, it changes because leaders recognize just how close they came to something far worse. And that realization can shape decisions for years to come. Final words. Long after the smoke disappears, long after the headlines are replaced by new stories, and long after the world moves on, the questions raised by this night will remain. How should nations deter attacks without triggering larger wars? How can rivals communicate clearly during moments of extreme tension? Can military strength create lasting security? Or is diplomacy ultimately the only path to lasting stability? Those questions have no easy answers, but they are the questions that define our time. Because in the end, the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not always the missile. Sometimes, it's the decision not to fire the next one. Fade to black. History is not only written by those who wage war, but also by those who prevent the next one.